All right, so we are starting in our new study tonight, and we're starting in the book of Amos. So turn to the book of Amos. He is right after Joel. Before Amos, you have Hosea, and then Daniel. So Daniel follows, Hosea follows him, Joel follows him, and then you come to the book of Amos. Okay? Amos is what's called, quote unquote, one of the minor prophets. The only reason why they say they are minor prophets, it's not because they have less important information than the other prophets. It's for one fairly obvious reason, and that is they have fewer chapters. You know, Isaiah has long chapters, okay? Daniel has, well, longer chapters, you know, and obviously, you know, you have Jeremiah, long chapters. So you have a series of prophets that have fewer chapters in their books, and that's quote-unquote called the minor prophets. Okay, let's read the first two verses of Amos 1. We're going to try to get through tonight verse 5. And as I go through kind of a background, I'm going to try to help you understand some of what's going on. I think Norman is going to like this book because we're going to be all over history. Okay, all over history. And we'll start on some of that tonight. So let's read verses 1 and 2. So it's the words of Amos, who was among the sheep herders from Tekoa, which he envisioned in visions concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, in the days of Jeroboam, son of Joash, the king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. And he said, the Lord roars from Zion and from Jerusalem. He utters his voice, and the shepherds' pastures grounds mourn, and the summit of Mount Carmel dries up. All right. Now, we pick up a couple things, both in this chapter and actually in the 7th chapter and a few other chapters of Amos. And one is that Amos worked as a shepherd in this town called Tekoa. Now, Tekoa, I don't know if I can show you. Well, I can kind of show you on this map. Not real specifically, but Tekoa would be about where I'm pointing here. It'd be 10 miles southeast of Jerusalem. Okay? So, he grows up and he works in the area of Judah. Okay? Not Israel. He grows up and works in the south, not in the north. But interestingly enough, as you're going to see, his ministry... Oh, that's great. Okay.
Can you plug it in?
Yeah, I'll bring it.
If you would bring it. His ministry, though, is to the north, not to the south. Now, he has a very interesting name, Amos, because his name means burden. So can you imagine naming your son Burden? All right? It could. yeah. Actually, we could. Actually, in some ways, but it refers, number one, and apparently, first of all, to the loading weight put on livestock to carry items, because he is a shepherd. But he's a different kind of shepherd, and you'll see in a minute. But it's also likely a nickname that was given to him by his adversaries, primarily because when they heard his prophecies, they were a horrible burden to them when they heard them. Because if you've read it all in the book, these are prophecies that are not fun. They're prophecies of judgments, almost all through the book. So it apparently describes his adversary's opinion of him by calling him Amos. Now, Amos, as I said, ministered to the north, the half called Israel, and he grew up in Judea. And in verse 1, he calls himself a shepherd, but it's an interesting word in the Hebrew. It's the word nokid, and N-O-Q-U-D, and it indicates several things. It indicates a breeder of sheep and livestock. Now, in other words, apparently he not only pastures sheep, but he breeds animals also, right? Now, there's another thing we learn about him. If you'll turn over to the 7th chapter of Amos, and we're going to look at verse 14. He says a couple very interesting things. Then Amos answered and said to Amaziah, I'm not a prophet, nor am I the son of a prophet, for I'm a herdsman and a grower of sycamore figs. So, sycamore figs. Yes, usually you have date figs that come from palm-type date trees. But there is a kind of tree, it's a sycamore tree of a particular kind, it's about 40 or 50 feet tall, and it produces a certain kind of fig. Now, it's interesting, this is a fig that requires, if you want to put it this way, maintenance. Because at a certain time when the fig begins to grow, the person who owns the tree, if they want good figs, has to literally score the fig, let some of the juice come out, which sweetens the fig and makes it grow bigger. So it takes that level of, if you want to call it, plant husbandry, I guess you would call it, to grow these figs. Now, he doesn't grow figs in Tekoa because there isn't the area to grow them there. He actually has to grow them further to the east, actually closer to what was originally the Dead Sea area, down in the bottom area, not in the mountain area where Tekoa is. So apparently he had groves of sycamores down there. In other words, this guy had to be quite agricultural. He had tracts of land apparently in different places, and he had different agricultural involvements in different places also. So in other words, Amos is not a professional prophet. He's a businessman. That's his background. Okay? So it's a very interesting background that God calls him to do this. And I think that probably when God did call him and showed him these series of visions, it had to really be quite a shock to him. He didn't expect it. Like he says in verse 14, I'm not a prophet by nature, nor am I a son of a prophet. You know, it's almost like he said, hey, you know, I didn't go to seminary, didn't get the degree, that's not me. And yet God still has good reasons why he picks this man to do this ministry. Now, you saw mention here of both the king at this time of Israel. His name was Jeroboam. He's actually called Jeroboam II. And then, of course, it mentioned the Judean king, who's Uzziah. So it's interesting that during this time, if you look at what's going on culturally, and we'll see some of it, we go into 2 Kings. We'll go into the book of 2 Kings, and we'll see some of this. But if you look at other areas of literature, you find some interesting things about this period of time. You find that both these kings had extensive militaries. You'll find that both of them had subdued surrounding countries. You'll find that both of them had growing trade routes, and there was a great increase in trade activity during their reigns in both Israel and in Judah. They had growing middle classes, and you'll see reference to this as we go into further chapters. It was a time of material prosperity in Israel and in Judea. And it was, as I said here in the outline, it was a short-term, quote, golden age, which would actually be put to an end fairly quickly, because as you're going to see as we go through this book, Assyria starts to assert itself as an empire and as a military power, and that puts the kibosh, especially on the northern part, Israel. In 722 BC, the Assyrians under Tiglath-Pileser, who was their most powerful, probably one of the most powerful kings, sweeps down from the north. Where's my pointer? Okay. Up here, and we can't see it all up here, but he sweeps down into Israel and literally comes within like 5 miles of Jerusalem, conquers all of Samaria, takes all these areas, conquers areas around them. He also conquers the Phoenician Empire. He conquers, this would be what today we call Syria, okay, Damascus being the capital, but it's not called, in ancient words, it's not called Syria, it's called Aram. Okay, and you'll see that in a minute. He makes references to Aram. So he sweeps down and takes all of this, and I'll talk more about what he does in those series of battles and the result of it. But he stops just short of Jerusalem. Interestingly enough, it was prophesied that he would sweep down and sweep away Israel, but it was prophesied that he wouldn't sweep away Judah. And literally stops 5 miles north and turns around and goes back.
We talked about it.
Oh yes, we've talked about it before, but we'll talk about it a bit more to put it all together for you.
Because this time there are 2 kingdoms.
There are 2 kingdoms.
Northern.
After Solomon dies, there are 2 people, okay, that Jeroboam the first and Rehoboam, and they end up taking the kingships. Therefore, Israel as a total nation splits, and that's how you get Judea and Israel in the north from then on.
Jeroboam, they both on his son?
Rehoboam was, and I think Jeroboam was not a son.
He was not.
He was I don't know if he was either a political person or a military person. I have to look at that, but he ended up getting a hold of the kingship there. So, think about what I just said. Extensive militaries, relative peace, growing middle class, increased commerce, increasing trade routes, growing prosperity. Think of that, and then think, as we read these prophecies of Amos, what he's saying is going to happen. Okay? And I say here, I think that the people in his time undoubtedly would have suffered from what we call normalcy bias. Okay? You know what I mean by normalcy bias? It's a technical term. We use it particularly when we're talking about disaster scenarios. You have a disaster that occurs. People are shocked by the disaster because they didn't see it coming. It was swift. It occurred all of a sudden. They weren't prepared for it, and they're frozen by it typically. Okay? So when you say to them, this has happened, they go, that couldn't have happened. That's not possible. That's what we call normalcy bias.
They reject the reality.
They reject the reality. It cannot be. That is not what's been. It's not what I anticipated it to be. It can't be. Normalcy bias.
It's 50 inches of rain in Houston and Galveston.
Right.
That's a perfect example.
Yeah, it is. And there's many, many, many examples of normalcy bias that occur. Normalcy bias is actually, and I don't want to go too far on this because my background is disaster training, but it's dangerous because it keeps people from doing what they need to in the crisis. They get stuck. They get frozen. Okay? And then things can get a whole lot worse for them real quickly. At any rate, now, for no more than 2 years, it appears, did Amos do his prophesying. So really a very short-term prophetic, ministry here. As I said, he preached an extremely unpopular message of judgments that were going to come, and it included, and you're going to see as we go on the chapters, it included judgments on 7 different nations. We'll take the first one tonight, and Israel and Judah. Okay? So there's literally 9 judgments that are going to be mentioned in the first couple chapters of this. Now, you'll see the mention, as we read in verse 1, of, quote, 2 years before the devastating earthquake.
Right.
Okay? And it's a very interesting reference because he is apparently God has given him a vision that the earthquake is going to come. Now, we have historical evidence of this earthquake. Of course, he mentions it here. 250 years later, it's mentioned again. And you've actually read about it. So hold your place here in Amos and go to our friend Zechariah, who we studied last year. Way just before Malachi, the very end of the Old Testament, Zechariah. And we're going to go to the 14th chapter, the last chapter of Zechariah. And we're going to go to verse 5. And you will flee by the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Azel. Yes, you will flee just as you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, the king of Judah, who we just read Amos is contemporary with. Uzziah, the king of Judah, okay? Then the Lord my God will come and all the holy ones with him. So, he's saying that there's going to be an earthquake, Zechariah is, just like the one that happened during the days of Amos and King Uzziah. So, think about this. He was extremely aware of the devastating nature of this earthquake during Amos's day 250 years before. I'm going to suggest to you it was not a minor tremor for people to remember it for 250 years. You know, actually, it's kind of like what happened in the Ohio Valley in 1812 during the time of Tecumseh. You know the history and all of it? Okay. Do you know it? Tecumseh, as an Indian chief, tried to align all the nations because of the influx of pioneers that were taking over Indian lands. And he went all around the Midwest, going to these tribes and these chiefs and trying to get a united nation of American Indians. And he was shown somehow a vision. There's going to be a massive earthquake. And he said, you'll know the truth of what I'm trying to tell you when you see the earthquake. And it occurred, I think the first part of it occurred in December of 1812. It literally made the Mississippi River run backwards. It was a huge earthquake. They estimate it as being 9.2 to 9.5 on the Richter scale. It was so strong that when it occurred, church bells in Boston rang because of the vibration. Okay?
It really centered over as much as Memphis, Tennessee.
It did, right in that area.
Right there was
Yeah.
the center point.
That is the epicenter of it, and of course there's still a great, not very long, but rather significant rift there, earthquake zone there. So, but you know, people wrote about it. There were extensive writings about it. You know, farmers talked about what happened during the earthquake. You know, buildings toppled. You know, all these things happen. You know, and you can go back and read, and you know, we even have a play down in southern Ohio that occurs in Chillicothe every year that reenacts the events around it. Okay, so it's kind of like that. That would have been almost 220 years ago, 215 years ago. So it had to have been a big deal during Amos's day, this earthquake.
Tecumseh was really an intellectual politician of the day.
He was a remarkable person.
Yes.
All right, so back to Amos 1. Now, we see that his ministry apparently began in about 762 BC. And as I said, we had evidence both in the book of Zechariah, remembering this earthquake. We also have in Josephus's extensive works a reference to it, and I wrote the reference down for you. I read it this week. It said Josephus wrote this very, very extensive, very long series of books of the history of the Jews called the Antiquities of the Jews. And in this, the reference is found in Book 9, Chapter 10, where we find this reference to the earthquake during King Uzziah's time.
Was he a Jew?
Oh, yes. Yeah. He was an official in the Roman Empire. He was a very educated man, but he was Jewish, Josephus. And had, you know, one of the great, I mean, there's several great historians. And Herodias was certainly a great historian. Pliny was certainly a great historian. But Josephus is, I think you would, world recognized as a historian of ancient history. So he makes reference to it also. Now you'll notice what's said here, verse 2 of Amos 1. And the Lord roars from Zion, okay, and which of course Mount Zion is almost literally in Jerusalem. And from Jerusalem he utters his voice. The shepherds' pasture grounds mourn, and the summit of Mount Carmel dries up. Now, obviously, he's talking about the tremendous effect of this judgment, part of the earthquake being part of that judgment. Now, earthquakes are often precursors to other things. They frequently occur before major events occur, and God uses them often to bring about a season of judgment. So let's look at a couple examples of these. The first one, why don't you keep your hand in Amos, but turn to Matthew 24. Very famous passage about earthquake. Remember in Matthew 24, Jesus is giving this lecture to his disciples because they've asked him, so what's it going to look like before you return?
Is that Anne's favorite?
That's Anne's favorite, right. That's right. And so Jesus starts on this very extensive discussion of the signs that would occur right around the end of the age before the return of Christ. And if you look at verses, I think it's 7 and 8, it says, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But notice what he says. But all these things are the beginning of the birth pangs. And this is often the case. There's another famous earthquake that occurred that we don't often think about, but it's found in Exodus 19, verse 18. You know what that earthquake was?
I'm sorry, the beginning of birth pangs, that means the frequency.
Yes, it means that the events that are going to lead to the birth, that being the second return of Christ to the earth, are going to become more intense, more frequent birth pangs, okay? And the earthquakes are going to kind of kick it off, okay? There's a famous earthquake, biblically a famous earthquake, mentioned in Exodus 19:18. What's the reference to that one? What's it about? It's a very important event that happened.
Oh, yeah. They got swallowed up?
No.
No.
Exodus 19, that's right before 10 Commandments.
You got it. This is about Mount Sinai.
When he stroked it.
No. God comes down and literally his presence comes to the top of Sinai. It literally burns the top part of Sinai, makes it black.
This is chapter 18?
This is chapter 19, verse 18, Exodus. Okay? And, of course, there's a lightning and an earthquake occurs. And this event precedes by a few days the giving of the Ten Commandments, the giving of the law. It signifies the importance of what God's going to do when Moses goes up there and literally by the hand of God gets 2 tablets written by the hand of God about that we call the Ten Commandments. Also,
is there an earthquake when the Mormons were founded? I haven't read about it.
Not to my knowledge. Palmyra, New York, huh?
Just thought I'd ask.
Yeah. In Revelation 6 also, let's go there too. Since we're already in Matthew, let's go back to Revelation 6.
Where the earth split?
No, not quite. This is this chapter in Revelation about, quote unquote, the four horsemen. Okay? Remember? Where we're told by John that there would be a series of events would occur. The red horse, which would bring war. Then there's, of course, the pale horse, or the kind of sickly green horse. Okay, it's literally what it means. Okay. Then there's the ashen horse, and of course, death and Hades follows. And then, of course, it says, and if you read, let me see where we're going to write it down here.
Verse 14 about earthquake.
Is it 14? Okay.
It starts up at 12.
It starts at 12. So as I looked, when he broke the sixth seal, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth. In other words, there was a tremendous amount of particle put in the atmosphere, which darkened the sunlight, okay? And the whole moon became blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to the earth, which means it's probably, it could mean meteorites, but more likely it's angelic beings, actually. And then, of course, the sky was split like a scroll, which means that, well, I'm not going to go into all of that right now because we actually studied Revelation. But the point is, again, it's the precursor. This is the very beginning of the judgments in the 6th chapter of Revelation. So this great earthquake ushers in an era of future judgments that are going to occur. So that's the pattern. The shaking. The shaking. So, back in Amos, chapter 1, again, the Lord roars from Zion. It indicates, of course, the image of a lion stalking its prey. It indicates the fierce nature of the coming judgments which God is going to bring upon these nations, including Israel and Judah. The idea of the shepherd's pasture grounds mourn means the normal tranquility of the pastures where the sheep would graze or the other livestock would graze is going to be completely destabilized. It's not going to be a normal situation. A pastoral scene is not going to occur when this happens. It'll be severely shaken. And it says Mount Carmel, okay? Now the word Carmel literally means a lush garden, okay? And of course we know in Israel on the western side, not far from the Mediterranean, is of course Mount Carmel.
What does it mean, lush?
Lush means full of vegetation, fruitful, okay? So and then of course it indicates that the mountaintops would crumble. Now that's a very interesting statement made here. Okay, the summit of Carmel dries up, all right? Because Josephus, again, in his book, The Antiquities of the Jews, book 9, chapter 10, in paragraph 2, talks about that during the time of Uzziah and the earthquake, literally segments of mountaintops sheared off and fell into the valleys. So this is clearly what Amos is predicting that's going to happen here. So,
but he's not talking yet about the reason. The reason why.
No, not yet. He'll get to that. The point here is that God is beyond what he will tolerate of the nations and from Israel and Judah, and he is uttering or roaring the judgments that we're going to study about here in the next several weeks. Okay? Now, let's read verses 3 through 5, and we'll start with the prophecy against Damascus. So starting in verse 3 of Amos 1, "Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not revoke its punishment, because they threshed Gilead with implements of sharp iron. So I will send fire upon the house of Hazael, and I will consume the citadels of Ben-Hadad. And I will also break the gate bar of Damascus, and cut off the inhabitant from the valley of Avon, and him who holds the scepter from Beth Eden. So the people of Aram, that is what we call Syria today, Aram, will go exiled to Kir, says the Lord. Now that should be as clear as anything, and probably warrants no explanation at all. But in case you want one, I'll be glad to offer a bit more to you, okay? So again, the area of Syria, the ancient word was Aram, A-R-A-M. Now, Amos uses a literary mechanism. We call it, in literary terms, we call it the X, X plus 1. In other words, you say something and then you say a series of other things. And the emphasis is that you're not necessarily talking specifically so much about the first in the series, but you're emphasizing the last in the series. 3 and then 1 for 4. Okay? I'm going to show you a couple other examples of it. But it's a style, and it shows some interesting things. One is, it's a very elaborate way to write. This is not a simple guy's Hebrew text. This guy was educated. He knew how to write. And if you look at the book of Amos in the Hebrew, it's extraordinarily poetic in nature. It has poetic style, it has poetic stanza, it has all kinds of alliteration. It's a very sophisticated Hebrew document, actually.
Being poetic, do you think is actually not very uncommon for a shepherd? But we cannot say the same about being educated.
That's the problem. If he was just a normal shepherd, then how would he get the level of education he obviously had to write this, okay? Certainly you're going to see many, many allusions to the fact that he is a shepherd, to the fact that he is agricultural, because we're going to get to a point where he's going to identify, I think it's 5 different illustrations, and almost all of them are agricultural illustrations in nature that he uses, okay?
But do we know where did he get his education?
We do not know where.
Obviously, probably just directly from God.
Yes.
Could it be that God gave him this and he didn't totally understand it?
Could be. It could be. Okay? Matter of fact, I want to mention here that of these judgments that are going to occur, okay, the first of them are right here, we've just started on, starting in verse 3, and they're going to occur all the way through chapter 6. Okay, so from where we are in chapter 1, going all the way through chapter 6, we're going to have this series and discussion of judgments. Okay? Then you're going to find that in chapter 7, through chapter 9, there's going to be 5 illustrations that he's going to go through in those 2 chapters. And then in the last part of chapter 9, you're going to find that there's going to be a kind of a summation that is prophetic. It's not just a summation of everything, but it's talking about that Messiah will eventually come. So it's a prophetic of the millennial kingdom in the last part of chapter 9. Now, let's try to take this apart. Well, let me give you a couple examples of this poetic nature, okay? Turn back to the book of Job, to your left here, and go to chapter 5 of Job, and we can find an example of this in verse 19, except the numerical nature of it's a little different here, but it's the same principle. Okay? From 6 troubles he will not deliver you, even in 7 evil will not touch you. Okay? So it's 6 plus 1 in this case, 7. In the case of what Amos is talking about, it's 3 plus 1. But it's the same kind of literary concept. Turn over to your right from Job, and you're close to the book, you're next to the book of Psalms, so go to Psalm 62, and you'll see another example of this literary usage. Psalm 62, starting in verse 11. Once God has spoken, twice I have heard this, that power belongs to God. And then he goes on and says, in loving kindness, you see, a first and then a second. All right? And if you want to turn over even further to the right, to Proverbs, go to chapter 30 of Proverbs. There's many more examples of this, but I'm just showing you a few of them. Proverbs 30. And we're going to look at verses 15 and 16. The leech has two daughters, give and give. Is that true? Okay. There are three things that will not be satisfied. Four that will not say enough. You see the principle. So the idea is what he's saying in this 3 plus 1 is there have been multiple reasons why he's judging each one of these nations, but he's only going to tell you about the culminating event about why he's going to enact judgment. So he's not going to tell you all the three, he's going to tell you the fourth.
There's also here in Proverbs where it says that there is 6 which God hates, 7
Yes,
which he hates.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's almost like God's saying through this poetic style, this is the final straw. This is over the top. This is it. Okay, and he's doing it in this way. So what he's saying is that he's making these judgments about all the surrounding nations, and that the Lord, and of course also to Israel and Judah. Now, in Israel and Judah, he changes what he does. The 3 plus 1 he does for all the Gentile nations. But when he gets to the judgments on Israel and Judah, then he enumerates them extensively. So he goes into rather great detail in those, and you'll see it as we get to it. Now the question is, what would be the basis for God making all the nations somehow morally responsible? It's an interesting question, isn't it? I was thinking about that. How could God legitimately say, you're responsible and you've behaved in a way that you finally deserve judgment from me? So let me give you 2 examples of why, one in the Old Testament and one in the New Testament. Okay, the Old Testament one, interesting enough, is found in Genesis chapter 9. So again, keep your hand there in Amos, but go to Genesis 9. Now think how early this is. Okay? In the very beginning. In chapter 9. This is literally right after Noah's flood. So there's a very, very, very limited population on the earth at this point. It's going to grow extensively, of course, but so look what he says, starting in verses 5, we'll read 5 through 7. And surely I will require your lifeblood. From every beast I will require it. And from every man and from every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For he is in the image of God. It is in the image of God that he made man. And as for you, then he goes and says, be fruitful and multiply. So right in the very beginning, God's laying down a universal human code, despite where you are, who you are, and what nation you ultimately live in. He says you cannot arbitrarily go and kill another person. It's a moral code. Mm-hmm. All right? Now think about it. If there weren't certain basic moral codes, no civilization could last. Mm-hmm. Right? Every civilization would, or if it even became a civilization, would devolve into chaos very rapidly without civil codes. So God knows that man has to have civil codes to make it, to have any organization that works whatsoever. Now there's a New Testament example of this also. Paul takes this argument and makes another argument out of it, and for this one, you're going to have to go way past Amos to the book of Romans. So go to Romans chapter 1, and this is one of the most famous arguments by Paul about the fact that God is justified in judging everyone. Paul's making this argument. God has the right to judge in the first chapter of Romans. So starting in verse 18, let's look at what he says. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and all unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. By implication, there therefore are moral truths that can be suppressed, right? The suppression of them means I'm not paying attention to those moral truths, nor am I obeying them. Does that make sense logically? Okay. Then he says, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. Every human being, and particularly before the grand theory of evolution, certainly could conclude that they didn't create themselves. Okay? Evolutionists somehow have come up with the ideas about how they think the entire universe came about through random chance over a long enough period of time, which I'm sorry is complete nonsense for about 1,000 million reasons. Okay? Certainly, we now have that concept in science today, so it's an explanation that man could have come about somehow without God. And yet, if you look at the design of so many things, I'll give you just one, okay?
DNA.
If I remember correctly, don't quote my numbers here exactly, I believe there are 257 base pairs in the hemoglobin protein molecule. Okay? All right? Now, if you took the base units, glutamine, adenosine, the 4 base units, and tried to construct the entire molecule in its sequence by random chance, they figured out statistically it would come up with the number 1 times 10 to the 80th power. Now 1 times 10 to the 80th is an interesting number because they estimate there's only 1 times 10 to the 50th atoms in the entire known universe. So you better do it like pretty well, or you run out of atoms real quickly before you get the job done, okay? So it's just, 10 to the 50th is considered mathematically absurdity. In other words, you studied math. It's an absurd number. There's no meaning beyond 10 to the 50th power. It's so big that there's no way to conceive of it, okay? So, when you look at statistics of genetics, it's an absolute impossibility. Do you remember the thing a few weeks ago when I took they took the human genome and they followed the base pairs through the genome on the first chromosome, and they took them and equated them with notes. Do you remember when I played it for you? Do you remember that? And you remember how symphonic it was? It's just they randomly took someone's first chromosome, took the set, attributed notes to them, and played it. And it's absolutely melodic. So how could it be melodic if they're random? Okay? Who did that? There just are so many arguments that tell you that this could not have occurred by chance. At any rate, so going on, he says, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through that which has been made. In other words, when you look at the complexity of the universe, when you look at the diversity of the universe, when you look even as simply as looking at the petal of a flower, okay, and you realize that every petal is a fractal equation curve. You know what I mean by fractals?
Yes, I do.
You know what fractals are? Fractals are geometric curves that are found all the way through nature, and you can generate them by numbers, but you find that almost everything that has a curve in it, from trees to the coastlines of everything, are fractals. Okay? They're absolutely geometric. So how? If it's by random chance, how could you have fractals in every imaginable thing that's created in the world? Okay? It's impossible. So he goes on, he says, verse 24, even though they knew God, in other words, he had to have existed. There must have been a creator. There must have been someone who started and designed this all, okay? For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations. This would be the evolutionists. They became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened, meaning they excluded the possibility that there's a creator. I can't accept that. And of course, that's what happens with evolutionists. The ardent evolutionists, if you show them the evidence that indicates that there's design in everything, they just exclude it. They basically are saying to you, I can't accept that information. I will not talk to you about it because I can't accept it. In other words, I have an a priori assumption. That's called evolution. And so I can't even talk to you about the possibility that there could be God. All right? So their foolish heart was darkened, and professing to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God, and this is what happens, next step, for the image and the forms of corruptible man, and of birds, and of four-footed animals, and crawling creatures. We call this idolatry. Okay? So the alternative to accepting God as the creator is worshiping the creation, which is called idolatry. And that's by nature why idolatry occurs, because it's the rejection of the creator. And the alternative that's left is you worship a material entity of some sort. Okay? So Paul makes a very strong argument saying that everyone as a human being is responsible to this. Everyone can know it, and everyone's responsible. Therefore, God has a legitimate legal right to judge because of that. Make sense? Okay. Now, let's start with explaining these. Let's go back to Amos now. And let me go through let's read 3 again. For 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not revoke its punishment, because they threshed Gilead with implements of sharp iron. So let me explain what that means. All right. The king of Damascus, of Aram, during this time, his name is Hazael. Do you see him there? In verse 4. Okay, he's the king of Aram. He has a son. His name is Ben-Hadad. Do you see him there? It mentions in the end of verse 4 the citadels of Ben-Hadad. Okay? They invaded Gilead. Now, Gilead is another term for something we just got done studying. It's the area that the 2.5 tribes occupied east of the Jordan River. That's called Gilead. So their military invaded Gilead, all right? They then attacked the Jews, and this occurred about 820 BC, historically. They captured many, many Jews, and they viciously tortured the Jews. And the way they did it, and I'll show you some other examples in Scripture, is they had devised threshing machines made of irons with iron spikes on the bottom. Okay, where they would tear like kernels away from cobs and things like that by pulling them over them. What they did to the Jews is they laid them on the floor and ran the threshing machines over the Jews. Yeah, that's what's being referred to here. In other words, he's saying Hazael very viciously treated the 2.5 tribes in the Gilead area.
So it's not any idiom or anything here. It's literal meaning of what
that's
happened.
That's literally what happened. Let me give you a couple examples of iron threshing too. Turn, if you would, to and let's see a reference to it in into this event in 2 Kings chapter 8. So turn back from Amos to your left to the book of 2 Kings. Chapter 8. We're going to look at verses 12 and 13. This is talking about the prophet Elisha. He lives during the time of this King Hazael of Damascus, of Aram, okay? So, verse 12, and Hazael said, why does my Lord, he's referring to Elisha now, my Lord, the prophet, weep? Then Elisha answered and said, because I know the evil that you will do to the sons of Israel. Their strongholds you will set on fire, and their young men you will kill with the sword, and their little ones you will dash into pieces, and their women with child you will rip up. They literally put the pregnant women on the floor, tied them down, and ran the threshing unit over top of them. That's what Hazael did to the Jews in that area. Verse 13, and Hazael said, but what is your servant? In other words, himself, who is but a dog that he should do this great thing? And Elijah answered, the Lord has shown me that you will eventually be king over Aram. In other words, buddy, you're the one that's going to do it. Okay? Elisha was shown by the Lord prophetically that this would occur. So, here's what God considered to be an intolerable mistreatment. And it's why he therefore says that he's going to judge Aram and specifically Damascus. Then we see in verse 4, so I'll send fire upon the house of Hazael. Now you know who Hazael is. He's the king. It will consume the citadels, that is the towers, his fortifications, even of his son Ben-Hadad. The end of verse 4. Verse 5, he says, I'll also break the gate bar of Damascus. Obviously, many large cities had huge iron gates, and they had large gate bars that they would pull down to secure the gate. And he's just saying that when this judgment occurs, your gate bar of your gate ain't going to help you. Okay, I'll break it wide open. And then he says, and I'll cut off the inhabitant from the valley of Avon, and him who holds the scepter from Beth Eden, so that the people of Aram, this area that today we call Syria, will go exiled to Kir, says the Lord. So let me explain what that means. Okay? Avon is a reference to an area today we call Baalbek, B-A-A-L-B-E-C-K. Baalbek was the center of a particularly disgusting system of heathen Baal worship. Therefore, God singles it out and says, I'm going to make certain I'm going to judge that too. I'm going to destroy that area in the process. Now, he also says that he'll destroy Beth Eden. Beth Eden happened to be the summer palace of King Hazael. So he says, not only your main palace I'm going to completely annihilate, I'm going to annihilate your summer palace too. He says then, and this is quite interesting, he says the people of Aram will go into exile in Kir. And you go, okay, where's Kir? Kir is in the area where Abraham came from.
Okay.
It's in Mesopotamia. And when you look back and you look at the Table of the Nations in Genesis 10, you find that these people, from Aram, okay, the Syrians, originally came from the Fertile Crescent area and emigrated down into the place that today we call Syria. So literally what he's saying is to them, when I'm done with the judgment, I'm going to literally spread you all the way back to where you came from. Literally he's saying, in essence, when I get done with you, there isn't going to be any trace of your nation or any trace of your dynasty left. you're done. That's what he's saying to them. When I do this, you're done. Now it's interesting.
Did Abraham come from
Which is in the same area as Kir.
Uh-huh.
Okay? Now, you say, well, okay, God says he's going to do this, but did he really do it? I mean, he's being very specific about all this stuff. And of course, we know that he did. There was a very famous general of Assyria. His name was Tiglath-Pileser. Now, the Assyrians had a period of time in their empire where they had some fairly weak kings and some fairly weak generals. But that era ended when Tiglath-Pileser took over, and he was a general who made himself king. He was vicious. Okay? As a matter of fact, the idea of what we call crucifixion was invented by the Assyrians.
Really?
Yes. Except they did it in a little bit different way. When they captured you after warfare, what they did is they went out and sharpened logs, the top of the log being very, very sharp, and they skewered you from the bottom to the top through it.
Little kebab.
They would literally line up hundreds or thousands of these things and impale their opponents on them and just let them sit there. Now that's psychological warfare, as well as a rather horrible, torturous death, too.
And you can see why Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the capital of the Assyrians. It's like, man, don't send me there.
But it was also common in ancient Russia.
Well, they did that, too. Yeah. The Scythians were during that time also, and they were the Western European Russian tribal group. Yeah. Okay. So, what happens is, in 732 BC, Tiglath-Pileser invades Aram. Okay? He sweeps down with his army, and he does exactly what this prophecy in Amos says he does. And by the end of a few years after that, they're completely wiped off the face of the earth.
This is after how long after the prophecy?
It would be 50 or 60 years
Oh, okay.
time when it finally was enacted by Tiglath-Pileser.
Uh-huh.
Now, let me give you an example of it to show you. Turn back to 2 Kings and we'll finish tonight. 2 Kings 2. I'm sorry, 2 Kings 16. Second Kings 16. Let me give you the historical reference to this. Now, at this time, this is the reign of our dear, lovely king of the north, Israel, Ahaz. You remember who he is? He has this very lovely wife called Jezebel, who is the daughter of the priest of a Lebanese cult group. Okay, he marries her, and they have this wonderful reign over Israel, where they kill an unbelievable number of people. They are, the Adolf Hitler and his wife version of this time. They're really bad. If you read through 2 Kings, what he's done, and what Jezebel does, and she's more
She's the one that brought it into
Yes.
Yeah, she brought it into Israel.
And she probably was more vicious than Ahaz was when you read through the accounts.
Didn't end up well.
No, didn't end up well for her, because the prophet finally said, "This is how you're going to die, woman." And it was pretty ugly how she died. She fell off a wall, broke her neck, and then it was prophesied that she'd be eaten alive, and that's exactly that. The dogs surrounded her, and literally nothing was left but her bones when they got done. And exactly, the prophet told her exactly how she was going to be killed.
You have all these lovely stories.
This is the Bible, ma'am. So 2 Kings 16, so starting at verse 7, So Ahab sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and deliver me from the hand of the king of Aram. That is, the guy we just talked about. Okay? And from the hand of the king of Israel, who are rising up against me. And Ahaz took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house, and sent a present to the king of Assyria, that is Tiglath-Pileser. So the king of Assyria listened to him, and the king of Assyria went up against Damascus and captured it, and carried the people of it away into exile to Kir. Okay? And put Rezin, which is another name, I believe, for one of their rulers, to death. So this is how God enacted the judgment. He used the Assyrians to do it. And Aram was essentially no more.
What a wonderful
Okay? Now, it gets more interesting starting next week.
creepy.
Because then we're going to talk about what happens to the Philistines. And we're going to talk about what happens to the Phoenicians in Lebanon. And and he's going to go through these 7 nations, and I'll establish the history for you of kind of what went on in those nations, why it is that God, the fourth, the culminating event, and why he says what he says he's going to do in the judgment against them.
It's not going so good over there at the moment.
No. Now, one thing I'd like to suggest to you, and I want you to consider as we go through this book, okay? I've said it before, but I'm going to remind you of it. History has cycles. History has phases. Now, history is not cyclical in the true sense of cyclical. In other words, it isn't yin and yang. It doesn't start at one place and end back at that same place eventually again in this constant loop. It has cycles that actually are teleological nature. In other words, they end up in a place, a final place. But these cycles of history, cycles of economy, occur over and over and over again. So one thing I want you to keep in mind, particularly as we get into the discussion of Israel and Judah, is I want you to think what relationship those events that occur in Israel and Judah that occur then might have a relationship to what's occurring today. Because I think you're going to see some very distinct parallels that are occurring. Prophecy has multiple fulfillments. Think about it. There was a prophecy about Christ coming, and there's a prophecy about Christ returning. There was a prophecy about Elijah, what he would do when he was on the earth. And there's a prophecy about what Elijah will do in the book of Revelation as one of the 2 witnesses. There's the prophecies and the events of what Moses did when he was on the earth. And there's a prophecy of what he will do future when he comes back to the earth as one of the 2 witnesses. You have multiple fulfillments of prophecies over and over and over and over again. So I want you to think about how this may also be prophetic, not only historical, but prophetic. It was fulfilled in their time or years after their time, but it may have prophetic fulfillments also in our time. So, okay? So that's your beginning to Amos.